Software's communicating, getting there at least. I hope. They have all those wonderful AI tools out there now, or at least they claim they're wonderful, and yet they still cannot make a progress bar that takes into account the past patterns of how it moves that can then accurately predict how long it's really going to take before it is ready. It is an interesting phenomenon in our world. There we go. Just about right. Just need to click a couple more buttons. And then we are good. All right. So now we can go back here. And now I can properly share my screen so we all know what we're talking about today. Okay. Look at that. More steps than usual, but it still works, and I appreciate the magic of the technology. I hope everybody is doing well. We are going to continue our discussion of the Book of Devarim. Of course, we are getting close to the end, as we are now in the month of Elul, the month that precedes the holiday of Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of the Chagim. That means we are in the home stretch for reading the Torah. And as such, it is not surprising that Moshe is filling in a few of the gaps of the mitzvot that are necessary for us to understand as we are about to go into the land of Israel. After all, many things were not important, so to speak, while we were in the wilderness. But now that we are coming into the land that we will settle, and recent history events, as we'll see, are fresh on our mind, Moses needs to clarify a number of positions that will become important for the near future. So let's go ahead and talk about that. And we're going to begin with a topic here, or focus on a topic, I should say, that is perhaps going to seem a little off-putting, perhaps confusing, because as most people who are participating in the Jewish world knows, Judaism is not a proselytizing faith, but we are also not a closed faith. That is to say, Judaism doesn't go around and demand that other people convert. Judaism doesn't go around and try to convince other people to convert with any sorts of promises or threats. Instead, Judaism says, look, we believe that God has asked us to follow Torah, and that means doing it in these certain ways that have been our pattern for thousands of years. It's the right way for us. If you would like to join, come on in. If not, then, that's okay. Just be a good person and you're okay with us. Yet here we're going to see in chapter 23, verse 4, and continuing on from a longer piece of discussion, that doesn't mean that the doors are completely open, at least at this point in our history. And we'll come back to that before the end, don't worry. Because as we see from verse 4, an Ammonite or a Moabite, it's much easier to say Ammoni or Moavi, is not to enter the assembly of Adonai. And that means not become Jewish. They cannot come into the Kehillah, the Kahal, even to the 10th generation, which is a standard biblical term meaning forever. No one from them is to enter the assembly of Adonai for the ages, as is explained in the second half of the verse. All right, so the Ammonites and Moabites, who are they? Well, brief family tree. We're going to talk about the reasons in the next couple of verses, but brief family tree. The Ammonites and Moabites are the descendants of Lot. Lot, you may remember, was the nephew of Abraham. He was the one who ended up down in Sodom, as in Sodom and Gomorrah fame, and was the one whose wife turned to salt, etc. As he fled with his daughters, the ones that had not gotten married, they ended up taking refuge in a cave, and in the interest of keeping this PG for the moment, although it's certainly a worthwhile discussion at another time, one thing led to another, and his daughters got pregnant. Their descendants are the Ammonites and Moabites. So you might think, especially since we have just read the text of the Mamzerim in the passage above, which are the offspring of illicit unions, that this is the issue here, that Ammonites and Moabites are the descendants of incest, and therefore they are Mamzerim by our terminology. And of course, that means they are beyond the pale and cannot become Jewish. However, that is not what the Torah says. The Torah, unusually, gives us an actual explanation. Sometimes we get mitzvot, often we get mitzvot that have only cursory explanations for the underlying motivation. But for this particular one, we get what is for the Torah, an extensive discussion. So, continuing in verse 5, why the Ammonites and Moabites are prohibited from ever becoming Jewish? On account that they did not greet you with food and with water on the way at your going out from Egypt, and because he hired against you Bil'am, son of Beor, from Petor in Aram, of the two rivers, to curse you. All right, so as always, there are a couple of things that we need to consider here. Remembering that, yes, the Moabites did indeed hire Bil'am. Very famously, you have to remember that talking donkey scene. You have to remember the beautiful poetry that God forced Bil'am to give as a blessing upon our people. You may remember that the Ammonites were not involved in that. And then we come back to the first crime that's being listed as the reason for not including them as even potentially becoming Jewish, unlike every other person on earth, is that they didn't greet us with food and with water. I mean, really? In the list of crimes? That's like right up there, indeed, listed before hiring somebody to curse our nation. I would think that a little failure of hospitality would be secondary to hiring somebody that you wanted to curse our people with in order that you could destroy us. I mean, that does seem the more significant. And yet the Torah does not seem to be putting it in that order. Now, you might be thinking, if you've only read so far and not looked ahead, that, well, you know, this was still a pretty terrible thing. So, yeah, of course, you know, Moab and Ammon are off limits. But as we're going to find out, it's not quite as simple as that. Well, let's finish up with their section first. But Adonai, your God, was not willing to hearken to Bilam, and Adonai, your God, turned for you the curse into a blessing, for Adonai, your God, loves you. Just reminding us of that special moment. And thus we are not to seek their well-being or their good all your days for the ages. Again, finishing off this segment about the Ammonites and the Moabites, and then opening us up for the alternative. But you are not to abominate an Edomite. And abominate is one of my favorite English words that we just don't get to say enough. Basically, we are not to despise, to hate, or reject an Edomite, for he is your brother. Who are the Edomites? Well, the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Now, Esau, as we know, was the counterpoint to Yaakov, and they had problems, to say the least, as we've talked about many, many times, and are as famously recounted in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis. But apparently, they are not our intractable enemy. They are not of such a cultural abomination that they cannot eventually, if they wish, become Jewish. They can become Jewish, and even if they don't become Jewish, we are still not meant to loathe them. We are not meant to look at them with disgust and revulsion. So how, with this juxtaposition, how do we reconcile that the Ammonites and Moabites, who didn't come out with bread and water and who hired Bil'am, get treated this way, but the Edomites do not? After all, the Edomites were our relatives. They were descended from Esau, but the Moabites and Ammonites are our relatives as well through Lot. So really, I mean, what's going on here? And then to add insult to injury on behalf of the Ammonites and the Moabites, you are not to abominate an Egyptian, for you were sojourners in his land. So even the Egyptians who murdered our children, who kept us as slaves for generations, who forced all of the plagues to happen in order to allow us to go free, who still pursued us to their own destruction at the sea, them we're not supposed to hate, we're not supposed to loathe, we're not supposed to abominate, because after all, when we went down to the land of Egypt first, that is to say, during the time of Joseph, we did go there in need. And wait, what did they give us? Food and water. They fed us. We were able to survive a famine when we went down into Egypt. So there is a very interesting bookend to this set of different nations. The Moabites and Ammonites have their crime listed first for not being willing to greet us with food and water. And the Egyptians are being unabominated. They are being put on the they're not to be hated list because they did greet us. They did allow us in during the horrible famine that Joseph had foreseen through Pharaoh's dreams. So perhaps there is more to this than just the casual idea that we lived there for a bit or that we have a particularly close relationship with the Edomites. Maybe there is something more underlying. And then we'll just finish off this section. Children that are born to them, meaning the Edomites and Edomites and Egyptians, in the third in generation may enter from them the assembly of Adonai. So in the ancient world, there was a cooling period, if you will, that if somebody was coming from Edom or Egypt, that there was a delay in the full integration into the community, but that integration was inevitable over time. All right. So I don't know whether you've ever scratched your head over the section or not. Hopefully you have a little bit, and hopefully I've gotten you scratching your head now. As I am wont to say, confusion is the beginning of learning, because if you don't admit that you're confused, if you don't admit that you don't understand, then you're not willing to hear any other explanation. And it means the explanation in your head might already be faulty. So you've got to be confused at some point in the learning process, and hopefully I've given you a little bit to think about, because now we're going to dive into our commentary to try and see how to untangle this unusual dichotomy between the Moabite and Ammonite on one hand and the Edomite, the Egyptian on the other, and what on earth is going on here in the listing of their crimes and in the history of our relationship with these people. But before we jump from here into our commentary text, does anyone have any questions in general about this section of the Torah that is not on that topic, since that topic will be coming our focus in just a minute?
I just had one thought that talking about the Ammonites and the Moabites here, and their two things that say that they did. One of them was withholding something positive, and the other one was giving something negative. And maybe this places importance on doing the positive thing above not doing the negative thing.
That's an interesting comparison. That they that one was they withheld a positive but didn't do, but tried to do a negative, and that the withholding is listed first, which reminds us that sometimes when we are plotting our observance, we often focus on avoiding the negatives, but in fact, doing the positive mitzvot are certainly in Judaism's eyes at least of equal value, and oftentimes more transformative, not just of ourselves, but of the situation around us. So definitely a good reminder that Judaism is not just focused on the don'ts, but very much is focused on the do's. And that's D-O, not D-U-E. But that will give me a beautiful segue, I hope, into our question here, because yes, that is in fact precisely the question of what didn't they do that they were supposed to do, and why is that so terrible? And then why does everything else seem secondary to that? And to look at that first, we're going to turn to our good friend Ramban, also known as Nachmanides. As many of my frequent viewers will know, the texts for Ramban tend to be a little long. Today is no exception, but that's because he is often synthesizing multiple other commentaries, and he actually wrote longer sentences, which honestly is appreciated. If anybody here has ever done any traditional Jewish study, sometimes you are left going, couldn't you have given another couple sentences to explain that? And Ramban did. But that does mean that we often don't get to use him because he is very long. But here, I thought his summary was so nice that we're going to get a lot of it. So buckle up. We'll be with Ramban for a while. So as we just saw, our quote to begin, our Dibur Hamachil, the starting line, because they met you not with bread and with water. So that was the big crime listed first from the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, let's break that down and give a little bit of history and context. Ramban points out something else. We find it stated, "You shall sell me food for money, that I may eat, and give me water for money, that I may drink, da, 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 as the children of Esau that dwell in Seir, and the Moabites that dwell in Ar did unto me." All right, so this is back at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 2. And there, it seems to imply that, in fact, the Moabites and Ammonites did allow them to buy food and water. So what do you mean you didn't meet me with bread and water? We've got a quote back in chapter 2 that makes it seem like they did meet them with bread and water. How do we reconcile this? Well, let's get to work. Now, many scholars, this is Ramban implying the other scholars prior to him, say that the Moabites did not meet them with bread and water, but that the Israelites brought it from them. So the first explanation of, if it says you didn't meet me with bread and water, how could chapter 2 says that we bought bread and water? And the first explanation is, that's the difference. You didn't give us bread and water, which would be the correct, hospitable way to extend a welcome to a group at your border. Instead, you only sold it to us. And that is the problem, that it wasn't free, that it was bought. Ramban is not buying this. But this is baseless, for it is adequate for a camp that they be sold when they want to buy. So he very commonsensically points out, well, yeah, we wouldn't expect another country to just give everything that was needed for the myriad of Israelites that were trooping by. That's asking way too much. I mean, sure, if I knock on your house and I am hungry and you should give me at least a meal's worth, but we don't expect the country to give an entire meal's worth to the entirety of another country. That's not the way it works. Buying it would be normal, and that seems to be what happened, and thus that explanation doesn't explain why the Moabites and Ammonites are being castigated and put in this very special category for a failure. And he goes on to explain additionally, moreover, Israel came not within the border of Moab. This is taken from the book of Judges when Yiftach is giving his recount to the Ammonites about the friction that is coming up, or Amorites, sorry. And the Moabites brought them forth bread and water for money. And scripture tells that the Moabites acted the same as the children of Esau, right? We just saw back in verse 2 at the top of this quote from Ramban that they did the same as Esau. The Moabites and Esau were the same. So why then were the Moabites forever banned on account of this? But the Edomites, it's declared that we are not to abhor them. So he is highlighting what I hope you already got from my initial reading, that there seems to be a stark incongruity here. And with this additional text taken from both Yiftach and Judges 11, as well as from Deuteronomy 2, it seems even more stark, because the Edomites, Esau children, and the Moabites seem to have done exactly the same thing, and yet one is being blasted and the other is not. Well, another attempt at an explanation. Rabbi Ibn Ezra, who Ramban loves to quote and often attack, stated that the expression, "as the children of Esau and the Moabites did unto me," refers to the verse, "Let me pass through your land, I will go along by the highway." But neither sold them bread or water. For the Israelites passed through Mount Seir, that's the Edomite territory, and Ar, that's the Moabite territory. It was only to pass through his city where he dwelled that the king of Edom did not permit them. This being the sense of the expression, "You shall not pass through me." All right, so Ibn Ezra is trying to say, okay, yes, they didn't actually sell bread and water. That's not what Esau and Moabites did. But what they did allow was the passage. But when it says that they didn't allow the passage, what it meant was they didn't allow the passage through the main city. When we talked about this earlier in our this year's discussion of the Torah, that the opinion here is that there was a separate road that was okay for the armies and caravan to travel down, that was away from the main areas of settlement. And Ramban is saying that Ibn Ezra is saying that that's what the Edomites and Moabites allowed, that they allowed us to take this extra road rather than go through them. And he's emphasizing that through them idea from Numbers 20. Ramban is not buying it. This interpretation of Ibn Ezra is also baseless. For the Israelites said to the king of Edom, let me pass through your land. That's verse 17. The language there is, let us pass, I pray you, through your land. And Edom refused to give Israel passage through his border, from verse 21. Thus, they did not enter the border of Edom at all. So he does not accept Ibn Ezra's gradation of pass through me. He says, look, the language seems quite clear in that same section that Israel never crossed the border of Edom at all in any way, shape, or form. Not just that he stuck to the main highway and avoided the residential area. No, he did not go through his border. So how then can you say that there was a kind of passage through Edom when in fact there wasn't? And he goes on to say, Ramban, and so it is written, and they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. This now from chapter 21, meaning to go around Edom. So if they could go through on some other road, why would they end up going around Edom? No, they had to be diverted because they had to retreat by the way of the Red Sea from Mount Hor, which is on the border of the land of Edom, but they did not come into the land of Edom itself at all. So, no, Ibn Ezra, according to Ramban, is wrong. It wasn't that they went a special way through Edom, but still were limited in a way that wasn't right. They didn't get to go at all. That's why they had to encircle the land of Edom to come around and backtrack and come all the way back around to enter the land of Israel, a different path. And as he points out from the book of Judges, Yiftach said it clearly. But when they came up from Egypt, as Yiftach is recounting our exodus as part of his diplomatic negotiation, and Israel walked through the wilderness unto the Red Sea and came to Kadesh, which is down near the Negev in modern-day Israel, then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, let me, I pray you, pass through your land. But the king of Edom hearkened not. And in a like manner he sent to the king of Moab, but he would not. And Israel abode in Kadesh. So both Edom and Moab refused to allow passage in the exact same way. Then he, meaning the Israelites, walked through the wilderness and compassed the land of Edom and the land of Moab, and came by the east side of the land of Moab, and they pitched on the other side of Arnon, but they came not within the border of Moab. So they looped all the way around this territory, which would be in the modern day country of Jordan, and ended up on the east bank of the Jordan River, preparing to come into the land of Israel, but having to do a very roundabout circuit because they didn't go through the land of Edom or the land of Moab. So therefore, Edom and Moab are equal in keeping us out. And that means, as Ramban explains, thus it clearly explained that they did not come into the land of Edom or the land of Moab at all. Had they come, the Edomites and Moabites would have sold them bread and water, for it is not customary for one who allows an army to pass through a land not to sell them bread or water. Okay, so like, look, okay, they didn't sell bread and water, but that's because we didn't go, but we didn't go because they said we couldn't go, and so we went a different route. So all of that for Ramban makes much more sense than saying, well, we kind of sort of went, or they sold it, but they didn't give it. None of that for Ramban is a compelling argument. The best way to understand all of these verses to make sense of what our actual route was is to say we came up to the border of these countries, they refused to allow us passage, and thus we also were unable to purchase any provisions from them, and we were detoured all the way around. Okay, everyone's with me? Hopefully following what Ramban is saying. Want to make sure the argument is clear enough. Okay. So it appears to me, which is how Ramban always tries to open up the paragraphs when he wants to explain his own idea about the topic at hand. It appears to me that scripture banned these two brothers, Ammon and Moab, son of Lot, from the congregation of Israel, because they were the beneficiaries of the loving kindness of Abraham, who saved their father, Lot, and mother also from the sword of captivity. Go back to Genesis 14. And by virtue of Abraham's merit, God sent them out of the midst of the overthrow, which is referring back to the time of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. Hence, they, the Moabites and Ammonites in particular, were obligated to do good to Israel, but instead they did them evil. What was that evil? One of them, the Moabites, hired Balaam, the son of Beor, against Israel. And one of them, the Ammonites, did not meet them with bread and water as they approached their territory. As it is written here in chapter 21, you are this day to pass over the border of Moab, even Ar, and you come near against the children of Ammon. Okay, now, so he's laying out that the big issue here is that they hired Bil'am and they didn't come out and greet, and that this was particularly galling among them, more so than among the Egyptians or the Edomites, because these two had come from a family that had uniquely benefited from Abraham's merit. Because Abraham had pleaded with God to help Sodom and Gomorrah, and although the cities could not be saved because of his pleas, at least Lot and his family were given an opportunity to flee. So they would not exist were it not for Abraham's pleading on their behalf. Likewise, when Lot was taken captive, was carried away by the kings that had attacked the cities of the plain, if Abraham had not come to his rescue, then Lot and his family would have been gone. And again, Moab and Ammon wouldn't even exist. So at the moment, we're sort of saying that they had a special obligation because they had had special benefit. Now, let's build on that a little bit. Down here to my next page. Now, Scripture warned the Israelites concerning Ammon, harass them not, nor contend with them. And yet the Ammonites did not meet them at all, meaning with bread and water, for otherwise Scripture would have stated, as the children of Esau and the Moabites, ... and the Ammonites did to me. But the verse 229, back at the beginning of Deuteronomy, does not mention Ammon because they did not meet them. All right, so what are we doing? Well, back in verse 29, let's go back to the top of our page here, which we quote here at the beginning. It says that they behaved as the children of Esau and the Moabites, but it doesn't mention Ammon. And yet Ammon is being castigated in our chapter. Well, that must be telling us that since Ammonites weren't even mentioned in the list of Esau and Moab, that they were even worse, because Esau and Moab at least met them, but Ammonite completely ignored, completely refused to meet them at all. Nothing happened. They knew that we were not going to trespass on their territory. We'd already been warned not to attack them, not to trespass, to only do things with their consent. And yet, despite that, they did not come at all. And we know that they especially didn't show up because they are not even listed among people who did stuff that wasn't great. They are absent from that list. Thus, argues Ramban, Ammon acted more wickedly than all of them. For the children of Esau and the Moabites, when they knew that the Israelites were warned against contending with them in battle, brought bread and water out of their border. But Ammon did not wish to do so. This is the meaning of the phrase, because they met you not, that they did not come forth toward them with bread and water as the others did. Therefore, Scripture mentioned an Ammonite first in our verse 4, and it cited his sin first, because they met you not with bread and water. And then it mentioned a Moabite and his sin, because they hired against you Balaam. So let's go back to our verse just so we can see this in context. So it says, an Ammonite and a Moabite, you're not allowed to you can't allow them in. So again, the Ammonites mentioned first, and then the Moabite. And then verse 5, on account that they did not greet you with food and water on the way that you're going out from Egypt, and because he hired against you Bil'am, son of Beor, etc., etc. All right, so what's going on here? What Ramban is doing is says we need to read verse 5 as being linked to verse 4, such that the two sins here are each respectively assigned to the two nations mentioned in verse 4. So Ammon is listed first, and thus the first sin matches them. They did not greet us with food and water. Moab is mentioned second, and therefore the second sin, that they hired Bil'am against us, is mentioned to match their crime, which means that the Moabites did greet us, but they also sent against us the Bil'am, which is why they are still in this list, whereas the Ammonites may not have hired Bil'am against us, but they didn't even show up, which the Moabites did. So each, the Ammonites and the Moabites have their own unique crime against us. But for both of them, their crimes are more galling than the crimes of Edom or even the crimes of Egypt, because they had already benefited from Abraham in a way that no one else had. Esau might have been Abraham's grandchild, but that doesn't mean that he had had a unique experience of having been saved and having been spared through divine intervention in the way that the Moabite and Ammonite people had. Thus, really, it is much more galling, much more problematic that the Ammonites and Moabites failed when we came out. And thus they get that special treatment when it comes to being permanently banned from our nation. Okay, questions or comments? I know that was a long one. Like I said, there's a reason I don't bring Ramban all the time, because it's got a lot to go through. Okay, now I want to take a little detour into the Middle history. We're going to look at Sefer HaChinuch, which is looking at this as Mitzvah 561. And unlike most of the mitzvot, where he details about exactly how we still fulfill the mitzvah in our current day, he was writing in the Middle Ages, this prohibition was practiced before King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against Jerusalem and exiled Israel and jumbled all the nations and mixed them with each other as he ruled over the whole world. So he is saying, in fact, this mitzvah of not allowing a Moabite or Ammonite in is no longer relevant, because when Sennacherib came up, he moved everyone. We know that he took the 12 tribes of Israel and scattered them throughout the Assyrian Empire. We know he took people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire and threw them into our land. And we know that he took people from all over his empire and threw them into where Moab and Ammon are, or were, and he took people from there and put them elsewhere, which means the whole populations of the world are mixed up. Trying to say, that because this person has the address of Jordan, for example, that therefore they are a Moabite, is completely wrong. The same way that even in the modern world, just because somebody has an address that says Israel, we don't automatically and legally consider them to be Jewish. We do need to double check a few things, because lots of people have been moved around all over the place, often against their will, sometimes voluntarily. But it does mean that the ancient categories of people are no longer the modern categories of people. And that was true already 2,000 years ago. And which is why in the Middle Ages, Sefer HaChinuch is writing this. So as he explains, after Sennacherib jumbled the nations and the children of Ammon and Moab were mixed with the other nations of the world, all are permissible immediately after they convert, as there is an assumption that anyone who separates, meaning leaves their other faith, and comes to convert is separating from the other nations, who are a majority relative to the children of Ammon and Moab, and with relation to the Egyptians and Edomites, which we can see more about in Mitzvahs 563 and 564 in that same book. So what he is saying here is, look, the majority of the people of the world, even back in the ancient world, but definitely now, are not Moabites and Ammonites. And when we have a complete mixture of people like this, we have to assume that any random representative of that mixture is from the majority. And since the vast majority are not Ammonite and Moabite, therefore any random person that shows up at our doorstep, we will assume is not Ammonite and Moabite. There is no way to establish whether they are from the Ammonite or Moabite kingdoms at this time, or like I said, even 2,000 years ago. Once it had all become a jumbled, these sorts of pedigrees were no longer halakhically, legally binding in the Jewish world, which is why if someone comes to me today and wants to convert, I don't have to check if they are a Moabite. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear. But I do want to go back to this question of, okay, so what is the Torah teaching us that is useful for us? Because, well, it doesn't even matter anymore. The Ammonites, the Moabites, Edomites, Egyptians, all of them can join the Jewish people now because none of them are true Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, Edomites, or at least not true enough in a way that can be verified that we would use the halakha to prevent them from joining or to have, special considerations. Okay, so if it's not still an operative halakha because of this principle, then what can we learn about the way that they are being criticized and the way that they are being stigmatized in the Torah section that we read? Well, we have to look at why they did what they did. That is to say, where did the Moabites and the Ammonites learn to behave the way that they learned? And this comes back to the underlying problem of Lot, which ironically is not the incest, which is no great honor, but is not considered to be the biggest problem for Lot. It was his choice to go live in Sodom. When he chose to go live down in the cities of the plain, down near in the modern world where the Jordan River and Dead Sea are, he was making a choice not just of, oh, it looks nice, but that was a particular mentality. And that is a mentality that is being explained here in Ezekiel. And every time we talk about Sodom, I always have to mention that although in the modern world, the English-speaking world often uses the word Sodom as a very particular type of sexual crime, that is in fact not at all what the Tanakh or the rabbis considered to be the primary crime of Sodom and Amorah, as we'll see here in Ezekiel. Your elder sister was Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you. Your younger sister was Sodom. This is speaking to Israel or Jerusalem. And you lived with her daughters to the south of you. Did you not walk in their ways and practice their abominations? What are the abominations of Sodom? Well, I know what lots of people in the modern world like to call them, but that's not what the Bible calls it. Why, you were almost more corrupt than they in all your ways. As I live, declares the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters did not do what you and your daughters did. Israel is worse. Only this was the sin of your sister Sodom. This is their only sin. Arrogance. Arrogance? She and her daughters had plenty of bread and untroubled tranquility. Yet she did not support the poor and the needy. In their haughtiness, they committed abomination before me, and so I removed them. Ezekiel makes it clear that the only central crime of Sodom was essentially selfishness, that they were so full of themselves, they were so happy with the wealth and the peace that they enjoyed in this very fertile river valley, that they chose to ignore the plight of anyone who wasn't thriving the way they were. And that arrogance, it may seem like an odd word for that, but that is the concept that is used again and again throughout the Torah, where people will often feel when they are enjoying the bounty of their work, the produce that they have grown, the wonderful way the land provides for them, that somehow that's all they're doing. Hence the arrogance. I made this. I grew this. This is mine. Because that type of arrogance then makes us mentally unwilling to share with others. Because if it's mine, why should I share? I earned it, and I don't need to share. And that was the crime of Sodom, that they were unwilling to share with anyone else because they assumed, because they had no respect for God, no respect for even their local deities, that all of their bounty was their own doing. And thus they had no obligation to share with anyone. And Ezekiel points out, just for that, they were worthy of being obliterated. But of course, Israel did even worse. But that's, the nature of the prophecies of listing the crimes of our people. We can use others as examples, but we tend not to focus on them because we are trying to learn about ourselves more than we are about them. So what do we see here? What was the fundamental feature of the Sodomites? Well, they were unwilling to share. And what did we see Ammon especially, and according to many other commentators, Moab as well, although like Ramban pointed out, that is debated, they were unwilling to share. Here comes somebody up to their border that is in need, wants to pass through peacefully, would pay for anything that they got, and they say no. What? How do you do that? Well, if you live in Sodom, then that's in fact exactly what you're going to do. And in fact, we do see that played out throughout the genesis of the Ammonite and Moabite nations, as we see the behavior of Lot's daughter and Lot himself. We can see that there was an intrinsic selfishness that had rubbed off from their experience in Sodom that unfortunately continued to be a embedded cultural practice within their people. And that cultural practice is, of course, antithetical to the practice of Judaism. And in particular, it is antithetical to the practice of Abraham. Abraham was most known for his hachnasat orchim, for his hospitality, for the openness of his tent, famous midrashim of putting his tent at the crossroad with doors in every direction. So no matter which way someone was coming, he could be sure to greet them and invite them in, to feed them, to make them comfortable. That was his character. The people of Sodom, and by extension, Lot and his daughters, and then the Ammonite and Moabites, they were the opposite. They would close the doors to make sure they didn't have to share anything with anyone. As the Midrash goes on to say, here taken from the Tosefta, the people of Sodom became haughty in front of God only due to the goodness he showered upon them. That's the great irony. It's if you only get that arrogant when you've got that much. Taken from the book of Job, where Job says, a land from which the bread had issued forth, its place was overturned as if by fire. A place of sapphire were its stones, and dust of gold were there. And now it is a path unknown even by brigands and unseen by the falcon's eye, totally uninhabited, and not even the animals want to go there, untrodden by the haughty beasts and not crossed by the lion. The people of Sodom said, since food comes out of our land, and silver and gold and precious stones and pearls all come from our land, we have no need that other peoples will come to us to diminish. Let us rise and prevent the wayfarers to enter our cities. It is the exact opposite of Avraham Avinu. It is, we've got plenty. We have no reason to need anyone else. You can see the inherent transactional attitude they have towards other human beings. Why would we let other people come to our country unless we needed something from them? If we needed something, like we had food and they had gold, and we had stones and they had food, then yes, we would have to let them come so that we would trade with them, and then we'd get what they had, and we'd have to give them some of ours. Yes, but but if we've got it all, then we don't need other people. The mentality of if I don't need you, you're not my problem. If I don't need you, stay out of my life, is the problem that led to Sodom's destruction. And it is exactly that same trait that is exhibited by the Moabites and the Ammonites when we are coming around towards the land of Israel after having left Egypt. They have that same mentality. And this, of course, is the reason why they said they could not enter into the land of Israel, because they were not of the right spirit. It's not that a person has to be perfect to become Jewish. It's not that we expect everyone to be saintly who becomes Jewish. But if you can't have the basic concept that other human beings matter and that you have an obligation to help others in need, especially when you are enjoying plenty, then yeah, that little threshold, if you can't get over that little threshold, then you're really not going to ever understand or be at home within the Jewish people. Now, you might be thinking, but wait a minute. I think I remember a Moabite who became Jewish. Didn't Ruth come from Moab? Absolutely. And as many people will point out, the underlying midrash will usually tell you that it's because the text says an Ammonite in the masculine form and a Moabite in the masculine form cannot become Jewish, but the feminine forms are not mentioned. Therefore, female Moabites and female Ammonites, or a Moabitis and Ammonitis, would be allowed to convert. Now, That's a great midrash, and it is accurate. But there is another layer of, well, why not? Yes, we could just say it's because it's written in the masculine rather than the feminine, but that's very unsatisfying because there are many mitzvot that are written in the masculine that are intended for all people, because Hebrew doesn't have a all people form. It has a plural masculine form that is meant to include all people, except for cases where it obviously isn't talking about all people of all genders. And sometimes that can be confusing. So we can't just say, if it doesn't say women, it doesn't talk about women. We need a little bit more reasoning to make this midrash work. Thankfully, Ramban again is going to show us that in the Talmud that reasoning was provided. An Ammonite, but not an Ammonitess. If she converted to Judaism, she may be married to an Israelite. A Moabite is prohibited, but not a Moabitess, because it is customary for a man to meet, but it is not customary for a woman to meet. That is to say, to bring food forth outside the border of the land. And so the rabbis also mentioned in the Yerushalmi and in the scroll of Ruth Rabbati, it is customary for a man to hire, but it is not customary for a woman to hire. Now, we could have a little digression about the sexism of the ancient world, where when somebody was coming that was a stranger, that only the man would go out to greet and the woman would stay behind. I personally don't think in the ancient world that was necessarily sexist. Unfortunately, the ancient world had a great deal more violence than our world today. We live in one of the most peaceful times in the entirety of human history, and one of the most peaceful countries in the entire history of the human people, although sometimes we forget that when we read the news. But that's not the focus of this particular passage. This particular passage is saying we can't blame the women for not coming out to greet us with food and drink the same way we can blame the men, because it wouldn't have been normal for the women to come out with food and drink. They wouldn't have been allowed to come out with food and drink. Therefore, they do not have as an obvious feature that sense of arrogance and of selfishness that the men of those countries must have had. So since we don't have any proof that the women were equally arrogant and selfish, they are not included in the prohibition against them. So it's not just that the language is gender inflected towards the masculine and not the feminine. It is also because there is a reason why the women would not have been given evidence, there would be no evidence against the women one way or the other of what their attitude is. And in the absence of evidence, they cannot be punished by permanently being denied entry into the Jewish people should they wish to join. Thus, Ruth is perfectly fine to come in. And of course, we see from Ruth herself exactly the type of characteristics that we would hope to see. She is a beautiful, loving, caring, and selfless person. She is honest and upright and an amazing character. And thus, by extension, we can see that the differentiation between the behavior of the men and the absence of behavior of the women was very well observed by the ancient interpreters, so that we kept out those that were stingy in that way, but we allowed those of generous spirit in. That is ultimately what we take from this in the modern world. There are no more Ammonites, there are no more Moabites. Thank God there are still Jews. But the basic tension of what do I share? And do I feel I need to share? Or do I only share because it's good for me in this transactional way? These are still problems that we wrestle with on a daily basis in our private life, in our community decisions. This is trying to remind us that one of the fundamental features of being Jewish is to say, look, I'm not so arrogant as to say that everything that's in my hands is mine because I have earned it exclusively. Some things have come to my hand through blessings that I didn't deserve, that surpass anything I might have legitimately have a claim to say I earned. And thus, I am obligated to share with others because it's not 100% only mine. I am not so arrogant as to say that. And so hopefully when we see somebody in need, we will be moved to do good for them, to share with them, to be grateful that we have been blessed and be in a place where we can provide that help. Hopefully also we will not be so prideful that when we need help, we refuse to ask, because asking for help is a sign that we recognize that we are bound together, that someone else out there may be holding what we need, and we can give them an opportunity to prove themselves better than the Ammonites and Moabites by simply saying, hey, I need help, and then allow them to act with that generosity of spirit, which has come down to us from the time of Abraham. So that's the end of our formal commentary. Does anyone have any additional questions or comments? Okay, then we will leave it there for today. I hope some of you are able to come tonight for the Anyone Can Pray class. We will be beginning Shacharit for the Shabbat service, but much of that is also the same as part of the weekday service. So hopefully you'll be able to come and learn something, even if you already daven smoothly and regularly. Hopefully there'll be some new insights for you. Take care, everyone, and be well.